Welcome back to Root Double. Before we continue, I just wanted to... Noticing that my thoughts... Processing the story as it was given to me... I'm gonna say, don't want to downplay the fact that Yuuri lost 10 years of her life to Labo. And despite taking care of her, they did keep her imprisoned. And despite having a reason to keep a handle on powers like that, like the third BC ability and all that, we haven't seen enough of the reaches of Labo, who essentially strong-armed Miyoko into keeping Yuuri there and wanting to keep Natsuhiko there too. We haven't seen enough of them to know what their true intentions were. If they wanted more than to just study and really contain, it's still not great keeping people out of society. That's why jails are such a scam. Such a mess. Because the American prison system operates for profit and not for rehabilitation. Like, realistically, in a just system of a world with BC, if you identify someone with the aptitude for senses sympathy, ideally, you should keep better tabs on them, because if they go bad, they have the potential to do some really bad stuff. But for the generally, you want them to understand the power they have and the consequences of misusing that power. But then you also want to let them back into the world. This is getting away from me now, but just wanted to touch base on that. We're still barely into this. We haven't even seen what the true depths of Labo's actions are. They're probably not good. To be clear, they're probably not good, and I don't want to downplay that just because in the heat of the moment I might have analyzed Yuuri, a child's initial actions in using this ability on her best friend. I don't want to downplay that. I think I explained well enough in the last video that yeah, it was bad, but she saw the consequences of her actions firsthand, where the rest of the time she was imprisoned. Let's make that clear. To say, they've done a really good job of kinda justifying actions. The first thought that flowed through my head was making no one unambiguously bad, but that's bad. But one side kept Yuuri imprisoned for 10 years. That's bad. But the game has done a really good job of justifying actions, so to speak. And yet, there's probably still more that we haven't seen about Labo. That we're going to learn about down the line. Because the one thing they did set up through all of this is that it's very much Miyoko. Very much, despite the fact that Yuuri was never treated badly. She had everything that she could to have a normal childhood except for contact with the outside world. The game did set up the fact that this is very much not directly stated, but very much imply that this is due to Miyoko's influence, and not Leibo as a whole. If Miyoko was not present in this equation, Yuri's life in Leibo could have likely have been much worse. Let's make that clear. If Miyoko was not present, Yuri's situation in Leibo would likely be much, much worse. Enough of me babbling, let's continue. And now she wants to leave, and I feel like we should let her. All the more reason to get through this. That one word signified the sentiment she had locked away in her heart for 9 years. Her hope for freedom. Natsuhiko nodded firmly and continued.
よし。それじゃその前にやることがたくさん残ってる。
そうだね。まずはマシロンを助けなきゃだね。
ああ。無事ならいいんだけど。
心配なら隊長さんにもう一度センシズシンパシーを使ったらどうかな。
え？離れていてもセンシズシンパシーって使えるのか？
Similar to telepathy and empathy, Senses Sympathy obviously had a usable range of its own. Considering how empathy's range was narrower than telepathy's, Natsuhiko logically concluded that Senses Sympathy would be even narrower. But
確かに初めて心に潜るときはほとんど密着していないとダメだけど、過去に心をつないだことがある相手なら離れていても心に潜れるんだよ。
I know your phone number. I know your mind phone number now, so I can dial into you long distance.
でもエンパシーの有効範囲くらいまでだけど。
そういうもんなのか？
メルト効果って言うんだけどね。一度でもセンシズシンパシーを使ったことがある相手とは心の一部が溶け合って2度目以降は格段に同調しやすくなるの。ヒコリンが今朝ラボに来た時、私はヒコリンと離れていても心をつなぐことができたでしょ。
そういえば確かに。
しかも隊長さんとヒコリンは何時間にもわたって同調し続けていたんだよね。だったらきっともういつでも心をつなげられるはずだよ。
そうか。
Having his mind melted together with Watase's wasn't exactly a pleasant thought, but the ability to sympathize with his senses at will was quite convenient.
わかった。ちょっとやってみるよ。
Natsuhiko said that to Yuuri as he attempted using Senses Sympathy on Watase. Where is he now and what is he doing? Has he reached Mashiro yet? Natsuhiko's 5 senses dampened, and in its place came the sights that Watase saw. Oh. While Natsuhiko and Yuuri were talking, Watase was concealing himself in the darkness. He heard someone's footsteps on his way to the factory, and quickly found a place to hide. Damn it, who's there? He couldn't tell whose footsteps they were. The Yukida's, Jun's, Kazumi's, or... No, it's too dangerous for me to bump into anyone right now, no matter who they are. Watase held his breath and waited for that person to leave. It didn't take long before their footsteps grew fainter and fainter, and then disappeared completely. Watase breathed a sigh of relief. If someone spotted him, then it'd cause all sorts of problems with bringing Mashiro Toba back to the secret room. To save that Mashiro girl as fast as I can. Watase broke off into a dash while keeping his guard up. He headed for the cargo lift room in the corner of the factory. Once he made it there... What he found left him stunned. Eh? Very little had changed about the room since the last time he'd been there. There was one part about it that was strange. Very strange. Rather, it was the lack of something that was strange. Oh! Oh! The girl who had been lying by the lift. Same girl who'd been confirmed dead after Kasumi and Jun's failed CPR attempts. Was gone.
どうしてあの子の死体が
With this being the second dead body that vanished on him that day, Watase just stood frozen in complete shock. Ooh, Chapter 2. Body had vanished. Watase was momentarily frozen in confusion in the face of that bizarre phenomenon happening to him again, but calm down. Noticing that the scene titles are also changing from all caps to lowercase depending on who we're in control of. Maybe someone just moved the body to another location, that's all. If that were true, then who would do something like that? Kasumi? Jun? Ukita? Or... no amount of thinking could bring Watase to the truth. No, now's not the time for this. My top priority right now needs to be finding that Mashiro girl and saving her. Watase then pushed his thoughts aside. Went over to the lift's control panel and tried repairing it. So first I should put this here. Watase went through a whole process of trial and error, figuring out how the part he got from Natsuhiko connected with a broken panel on the wall. That's not it. Now take these wires and connect them to this. This is the open button, so this must be the close button. He manually connected the torn off wires and kept clicking the button over and over again, and soon enough... Whoa, that looks as good as new. Heard the control panel beep. Oh, by the sound of the lift going down.
成功だ
Watase found himself instinctively pumping his fist triumphantly. I just hope that'll find Mashiro Toba in there when these doors open. This is the only place I haven't looked yet after all. Please be in there. The sound of lift ascending filled Watase's ears as he thought that. There you are, when the doors open. Found himself faced with a lone girl lying there.
ちょっとおい
Watase ran over to her as horror filled him. The last survivor had indeed been on the lift, but she was horribly injured.
君大丈夫か
The girl's face was so pale, almost distracting from the blood pouring down her arm. She didn't respond to Watase's cries. You could tell she still had a pulse and was breathing, though both were faint. She unconscious. Now that he looked closer, her face looked familiar. She was the girl who he'd seen with Natsuhiko on that footage they'd found in the surveillance room several hours back. There's no doubt about it. This is Mashiro Toba. Unlike the healthy, uninjured girl he'd seen in the footage, this one looked like she was a step away from death. What the world happened to her? Wouldn't you want to know? Just he had thought that. A bizarre image flashed through his brain. Uh-oh.
何これいや痛いよ夏彦
大丈夫かマシロ今手当てを
動いている的には意外とちゃんと当たらないもんだな
Oh, hello. Huh? Sudden images and voices that played back in his head sent tremors running through Watase's body.
今のは
He'd first seen a boy and a girl running off somewhere through a security gate. What directly followed that image was a dry sound. With that came a man's voice. Guess it's harder to hit a moving target than you'd think.
あの声は
Me! It sounded a lot like Watase's voice.
どういうことだなんで俺があんなことをあれじゃまるで
A terrorist. Before Watase's horrifying train of thought could continue, he was interrupted.
渡せ
Oh. This time, the auditory hallucination echoed through his head.
落ち着いてくれ渡せその子は死にかけてるすぐにその子を救助してシェルターに戻るんだいいかお前はレスキュー隊員なんだぞ自分の使命を果たしてくれ
Thank you, Conscious. Watase did his best to curb his bewilderment and managed to somehow pull himself together. That's right, I'll save this girl. There's no way in hell I can let her die on me. Not on my watch. Probably needs a blood transfusion right about now. Distracted himself over from his earlier thoughts with its self-persuasion and kept repeating it in his mind over and over again. Then walked up to Mashiro and lifted her in his arms.
そうだそれでいい
The auditory hallucination sounded relieved. What happens when he figures out that the auditory hallucination sounds a lot like this Natsuhiko boy I just met? Although that's probably a limitation of the engine, and perhaps hearing telepathy. I was gonna say, perhaps hearing telepathy is audibly different from processing someone's voice externally. But the way it's been depicted, that doesn't seem to be the case. Unless he said nothing and something something. He rushed out of the cargo lift while carrying Mashiro on his back. He first made a stop at the Area 5 infirmary. He's probably not gonna make it without a transfusion. Just tell me there's another transfusion kit here. Searched the room to find there was exactly one other kit left. Put it in his pocket and then carried blood packs under his arms, one of each blood type. Could he'd treat her here, but this was too dangerous. It was likely he'd be attacked by Jun, Ukita, or Kazumi if he stayed. Going back to the shelter is the best move. It's the safest place we've got. Watase propped Mashiro up on his back again and left the infirmary. Carefully made his way to the shelter while keeping a close eye out for Ukita, Jun, and Kazumi. He soon made it back to the keypad.
Natsuhiko-kun, 聞こえるか? 俺だ, Kasasagi da.
Pounded on the door and shouted, and soon enough the wall slid open, revealing the iron door. His return to the shelter was immediately followed by Yuuri crying out.
Mashiro!
She cried out what seemed to be a nickname for Mashiro and ran over to them. It looked like Mashiro was another friend of Yuri's.
隊長さん、マシロンがぐったりして。
大丈夫、気を失っているだけだ。
Watase laid Mashiro on the floor and gave that reply.
だが腕を怪我してて血を流しすぎたかもしれん。リフトのカゴの中にずっと閉じ込められていたらしい。何時間も治療も受けられず。
Natsuhiko glared at Watase and spoke in a low voice.
確かにひどい怪我ですね
I wonder how she got it.
ああ、すぐに輸血をしなきゃまずい。君たち、この子の血液型知らないか？
B 型です。マシロが前にそう言ってました。
よし、B だな。
Watase read the instruction manual that came with the transfusion kit as he checked her for any acute reactions. And he managed to start giving Mashiro the transfusion.
これでひとまず安心かな。
Watase sighed. Natsuhiko then called out to him in a restrained voice.
安心ってことはないでしょ。こんなに大怪我してるんですよ。何がどう安心なんですか？
We found
マシロ
her.
に何かあったらどう責任取ってくれるんですか？
Dude! Watase was confused by Natsuhiko's abrupt outburst. Is he mad that I took my time setting up the transfusion? She's here now. It was at that moment that it hit him. He'd heard that rough, impatient tone in Natsuhiko's voice somewhere before. Well, that happened sooner than I expected. Very recently, in fact. It was much like the tone of the auditory hallucination. Hmm? Flashed like lightning zapped through Watase's head when that thought hit him. Huh? Hold on, didn't Teach say? Wait, don't tell me. Watase felt shivers down his spine. He kept that nagging suspicion locked away for the time being and apologized to Natsuhiko.
すまない。軽はずみに一安心なんて言ったことは謝る。
いや、いいんですか？
でも彼女の傷は君の怪我よりは軽いように見える。確かなことは言えないが、きっと輸血を続けていれば大丈夫だ。
Natsuhiko clearly wasn't fully placated, but he backed down. Once he confirmed that, Watase then quietly voiced the revelation that just hit him.
ところで、夏彦君、一つ聞いてもいいか？実はユーリにはすでに話したんだが、俺はこの施設の中で目覚めた時から時々幻聴を聞いていたんだ。だが その幻聴から受ける印象と君と喋った時の印象がよく似ているんだよ。どこがどうとは言えないが。
Maybe it is harder to recognize voices from BC to IRL.
何が言いたいんですか？
いや、前に先生から聞いたんだが、君たちはテレパシーを使えるんだろ？もしかして俺が聞いていた幻聴とは君のテレパシーだったんじゃないのか
Watase told his suspicions to Natsuhiko at one quick swoop. Mysterious fear welled up within him as he did so. Natsuhiko shook his head with a straight face. Is he going to pull a suspiciously specific denial? I have not used telepathy on you once since you got here.
僕があなたにテレパシーを？まさか
Yep.
ありえませんよ。
Yep, it was not telepathy. It was senses sympathy.
僕はずっ
You
と
fool.
N エリアで気を失っていたんですよ。
まあ確かにそうだが。
大体そんなことする理由がありません。あなたの幻聴の原因については僕にも分かりませんが、少なくとも僕とは関係ないでしょうね。
そうか。
Deep down, he didn't fully believe Natsuhiko, but he had no choice but to back off. If he kept pressing Natsuhiko on this, he'd think he was a nut.
くだらないことを言って申し訳ない。話を変えよう。
そうですね。その方がいいと思います。
まずは今後どうすべきかという話だが。
Natsuhiko interrupted before Watase could finish.
サリをここに連れてきてもらえますか？彼女は橘さんに階段から落とされた後、今も気絶したままの可能性があります。
サリオ？いや、もちろん構わないが。
How do you know that?
あの子は俺をものすごく敵視しているんだ。
Couldn't let Natsuhiko know why that was. Still didn't want to believe what she'd said back at the bulkhead.
だから俺が彼女のところに行ってもまた暴れられるだけかもしれないぞ。
でも今は気絶している可能性が高いですし、僕のところまで連れてきてくれればもう大丈夫です。彼女は僕の友達です。僕が言えばきっと暴れたりはしません。
そうなのか。
To be honest, he still felt rather reluctant to do so, but he'd feel awkward about leaving Sally the way she was.
隊長さん、私からもお願いします。サルちゃんをどうかここまで無事に。
分かったよ。任せてくれ。
Watase, I choose you! Watase put on a brave face and left the shelter. After Watase had left the shelter, Natsuhiko glared at the shut door for a while. Yuuri accosted him.
ヒコリン、どうして隊長さんにあんなことを？
ごめん、冷静さを欠いてしまった。傷ついた真白を見た途端、どうしても渡瀬が許せなくなって。
That makes sense.
じゃあやっぱり真白のこの傷は隊長さんのせいで？
そうさ、記憶を失う前の渡瀬に撃たれたんだ。
Natsuhiko gave Yuuri a summary of the events that led him up to here. After Yuuri erased her phantom, Watase caught up to Mashiro and Natsuhiko and shot them. At the end of that struggle, Natsuhiko passed out in Area N. Afterwards, he saw the 6-hour escape drama through Watase's 5 senses. Once Yuuri had heard the entire story, she spoke painfully.
そんなことが。
ああ、今の記憶を失った渡瀬は記憶喪失前の渡瀬とはまるで別人だってのは分かってるんだけど、それでもやっぱり僕はあいつを心から許すことはできない。
Tore his heart apart to look at Mashiro's pale face as she lay on the ground. It seemed that Mashiro had used up the last remaining bit of her strength to send that final telepathy. Probably passed out as soon as she finished communicating with Natsuhiko.
どうか無事に目覚めてくれ。
Natsuhiko and Yuuri held Mashiro's hands and prayed. They couldn't spend all their time praying. Natsuhiko was worried about Mashiro, but there were many things he needed to confirm if he wanted to escape outside with her.
なあ、ユーリ。 僕らはこのラボについてほとんど何も知らない。今日ここで起きていることの本当の意味を知らないんだ。だけどユーリはこのラボにいたんだから知っているんじゃないのか。
When he saw Yuri's memories, he learned that Labo was a BC-related research facility. There were still many mysteries left unsolved.
N エリアにあったものはあの WX 粒子増幅器とかいう機械は何なんだ。原子炉じゃないとしたら何が施設内に蔓延しているんだ。メルトダウンと呼ばれていた現象は何なんだ。プロキオンに表示される数値は何だ。 AD って結局何の薬なんだ。疑問はいくらでも思いつくんだけど、ユーリ、君は答えを知っているのか。
See? I think what really took me out of Yuri's story, and what led to me reacting unfavorably, was the fact that it was presented so immediately. Like, some of the reveals in there could have been, I don't know, maybe spread out or something, or just held back a bit till a bit later. But, like this the kind of stuff that we did get some of this. So it fits where it was, but as habit of this game has a real habit of explaining away my initial objections and justifying the decisions they make into telling the story. I should really just stop. Yuuri softly nodded.
全部知っているよ。ラボで過ごした9年の間に私もいろんな知識を得たの。世間には全く公表されてない事実も知りたくもないようなことも、知ってしまったら後戻りはできなくなるかもしれないよ。それでもヒコリンは知りたいの。
And if we're going into a more in-depth explanation, in-depth flashback to Labo, then definitely it makes sense to give Yuri's story first before getting into this stuff.
構わない。教えてくれユーリ。ここで何が起きているかっていうことを。
Yuuri quietly began to answer Natsuhiko's question.
一つずつ順番に答えていくね。まずは WX 粒子というものについてだけど、その前にヒコリンは BC 粒子を知っているよね。
うん。
Now that you mention it, he remembered what he learned from the class they had earlier.
BC 粒子 BC の使用に関する素粒子の総称。これは生物の、とりわけ人間の精神活動を形作り、また伝達する素粒子なのよ。
This is the third time we've had this explained to us.
BC 粒子は我々の周囲に満ちていて、かつあらゆる物質を透過する性質を持っているの。当然皆さんの頭蓋骨も、さらにその中の脳も、そして脳で行われている精神活動、脳内を行き交う電気信号からなる思考の情報、
We really have to sit through this again.
それを周囲に伝播させる性質を持っています。
知ってるけど、それが
Okay, the quick summary. Right after he said those words that Natsuhiko picked up on Yuri's implication. If it was a BC research facility, so for her to bring up BC particles meant...
WX 粒子も BC 粒子の一種なの。 BC 粒子が伝播する情報イコールエネルギーの量は、普通コミュニケーターが BC を使った時に増加。 WX 粒子増幅器はコミュニケーターがいなくても機械の力でそのエネルギー量を増幅することができるんだよ。何の情報も書き込まれていないけど、エネルギー量のみが極端に高い状態。そうなると BC 粒子は別の性質を持つの。
Oh. The B particles contain information and energy. Like when they're charged with information, they're charged with energy. and they transmit it. But WX were essentially artificially supercharged with energy. And if W particles are transmitting information with energy, by supercharging them, W extreme particles, then that's naturally going to interact with the minds of communicators.
それが W エクストリーム粒子、通称 WX 粒子なんだ。
Now that you mentioned it, Natsuhiko's mother did talk about something like that in Yuuri's memories. She'd said that BC particles written with information were called M particles. Alright, particles not written with information were called W particles. I got them backwards. What Natsuhiko could surmise, it appeared that WX particles were derived from W particles. No information, but super energy.
別の性質を持つっていうと、例えばどういう？
まず WX 粒子が蔓延している状況下では PC の使用効率は飛躍的に上昇するの。例えば弱々しいテレパシーでも強力に増幅されたり、ものすごく長時間にわたって PC を使い続けることができたり、ヒコリンも今日初めてセンシズシンパシーを使ったのに6時間以上も隊長さんと心をつなぎ続けることができたでしょ。
Now that you mention it, it was quite an amazing feat for him to have pulled off. Especially considering how it took Yuuri an entire month of training as a child to obtain the same ability Natsuhiko obtained in a flash. Natsuhiko's BC ability did indeed advance rapidly. Apparently he had at least some backing from these WX particles.
この WX 粒子増幅器を利用してラボはいろんな BC 能力の研究開発をやってきたの。でもねヒコリン、あの機械の運用はとても難しいんだ。エネルギー量や稼働状況もスーパーコンピューターを使って制御しなければならないんだけど、でも今日それが制御不能になった。 WX 粒子増幅器が暴走したんだよ。
Oh.
暴走？
Yuuri quietly nodded.
原因はわからないけど何時間にもわたって WX 粒子が生成され続けるっていう異常事態が発生したの。それが今この施設の中で起きていることの正体。
So it's genuinely abnormal and not just a controlled experiment.
メルトダウンと呼ばれていた現象は WX 粒子が際限なく増えて施設内に蔓延する状況のことなんだよ。
そういうことだったのか。
I'm just looking, it didn't show up on OBS, but that did pop an achievement, probably for half tips. Which really wasn't a nuclear meltdown at all. It's apparently just a one-word shorthand for extremely high in energy BC particle proliferation.
じゃあプロキオンに表示される数値はもしかして BC 粒子のエネルギー量のことか。
正解だよヒコリン。プロキオンは放射線量測定器じゃなくて BC エネルギー測定器なの。その場に蔓延している BC 粒子や WX 粒子がどれだけエネルギー量を持っているかというのを測定して数値化する機械。ちなみに MSV っていうのは、ね、ミリシーベルトの略じゃなくてミリスカラーバリュー。
Ah. MSV doesn't stand for millisieverts. I kept calling it millisieverts, and that's wrong. It stands for milliscalar value.
BC 粒子が持つ情報エネルギーを示す単位だよ。
As he listened to Yuri's explanation, Natsuhiko gradually understood more and more about Labo. Labo wasn't merely misrepresenting itself as a nuclear power research institution in name. Several parts of their research coincided with nuclear power science here and there.
この符号は意図的なものなのか、それとも偶然なのか。
Really intentional.
もちろん意図的なものだよ。
Obviously.
プロキオンとか AD みたいな外部の人の手に渡る可能性があるものは全て原子力に関するものに偽装されてるの。 ラボの正体を世間に隠すための細工の一環だね。
But Natsuhiko thought about it. That was right. There were probably several more similar countermeasures against industrial espionage in place, such as the use of several secret code words like Case N, Meltdown, and AD. Labo had been carefully hiding its true nature in consideration of worst-case scenarios like this one.
話を戻そう。プロキオンが BC エネルギー測定器だとしたら AD ってのは
AD は BC 粒子のエネルギーを吸収相殺する薬だよ。それを投与するとどうなるかっていうと、まず効果 1、BC が使えなくなる。そして効果2、他人からの BC の影響を受けなくなる。
Ah. That's why Natsuhiko faded out when Watase took his AD.
つまり BC が使えなくなる代わりに、体と頭脳を他人の BC から保護する薬、それが AD なんだよ。
そうか。だから僕はあの時
Natsuhiko remembered. If the mind was connected to Watase's, Natsuhiko would sink into the darkness whenever Watase injected himself with AD. It wasn't that Natsuhiko's sensations would cut off, it was that Watase, the BC target, would become temporarily immune to the effects of BC. Natsuhiko's mind would try to connect with Watase's, but the AD would reject it. As a result, Natsuhiko would be unable to receive any of the information that Watase's mind was supposed to be sending. So without any information, Natsuhiko would be thrown into darkness.
有効時間は1時間ってのは本当なのか？
あれは本当。AD は4000ミリスカラーバリュー以下の環境下で有効ってのも本当。逆に言えば4000ミリスカラーバリュー以上になったら AD の効果は消えちゃうってことだね。コミュニケーターは BC を使えるようになるし、他人からの BC の影響を受けるようにもなるんだよ。
That would explain why Natsuhiko's consciousness returned every time Watase went into a contaminated zone. How the two of them remained constantly connected once the facility's milliscalar value rose past 4,000 milliscalar. Both were a result of the conflict between BC, the power to connect people, and AD, the drug that resists that power. AD surrounds BC in the alphabet.
でもそういう、
何ヒコリ？
施設内のエネルギー量が徐々に上昇していったのはどういうわけなんだ？
それはね、BC 絶縁体が WX 粒子のエネルギーを吸収しきれなくなったからなんだよ。
Ah, yes.
え？
Natsuhiko knew about BC insulators. He even had a conversation about them with Sally just a few days ago.
なぜ BC の授業では専門の教室に移動しなければならないの？
Here's that conversation now.
BC ルームの壁には BC 絶縁体っていう BC を遮る特殊な建材が使われているんだ。
I shouldn't gripe. That is kind of nice callbacks. When it's just a casual conversation and not calling back to the lectures, which I hated. As Natsuhiko remembered that exchange, Yuuri continued.
実は
And they're also short.
この施設の壁やセキュリティゲートは全部 BC 絶縁体でできてるんだ。BC 絶縁体は BC を遮るよね。あれは BC 粒子が持っているエネルギーを吸収してるってことなの。WX 粒子も BC 粒子の一種だからもちろん例外じゃない。N エリアで発生した WX 粒子は周囲の壁とかセキュリティゲートにエネルギーを吸収されちゃうんだよ。でもその吸収率には限界があるの。永遠と WX 粒子を浴び続けていたらどんどん絶縁効果は薄れていってしまう。
Ah. I mean, that feels like a design flaw of sorts. You know, if considering their lockdown cycle, they know it lasts 9 hours.
吸収率の低下に反比例して N エリア外に蔓延する WX 粒子のエネルギー量は上昇する。
So, I suppose there is the factor of the explosions maybe damaging the absorption, which definitely caused the levels to increase more in certain areas. And probably overall increase the spread, so maybe that's the flaw in why the levels got so high.
それが徐々にプロキオンの数値が上がった理由だよ。
じゃあエリアごとにばらつきがあったのは第4エリアとかは他のエリアより数値が高かった。
Once again, that makes sense.
多分あちこちで起きてた火災とか爆発で BC 絶縁体が破損しちゃったからかな。破損が激しいエリアでは絶縁体の吸収率は一層下がって結果的に WX 粒子のエネルギー量も上がってたんだね。
Which pretty much lines up to the original nuclear power explanation, right? Well, Natsuhiko thought about it, that did sound plausible. B2 of Area 4, the most heavily contaminated area, had been horribly damaged by fire. Considering how much of it had burned, a good majority of the insulator must have been damaged. Next highly contaminated area, B2 of Area 5, was right next to Area 4, so the contamination may have spread all the way over there. There's no definitive proof, but Yuuri's conjectures seem plausible enough.
すごいなユーリ。この施設のことなら何でも知ってるって感じだ。
もう9年も住んでるんだもん。詳しいのも当然だよ。閉じ込められていたとは言っても一応我が家だし少しは愛着もあるんだよ。
Yuuri gave an ambivalent smile. Her smile pained Natsuhiko's heart as he asked more questions.
ユーリのおかげで WX 粒子やラボのことは大体分かったけどもう一つ重要なことがある。 WX 粒子の危険性についてだ。増幅器のマニュアルには WX 粒子は人体に有害だと書いてあった。渡瀬たちもプロキオンの数値が高いところにいると体に異変が出ていたよ。
Natsuhiko recalled the contents of the manual that Watase and Kazumi had found in the engine room. It said the following. And again, I'm doubling back on my own criticism, but in terms of repetition, but now this is definitely ultimately what these are just refreshers on things that were discussed in earlier rounds. Properties of WX particles have extremely harmful effects to the body. Examples of this include dysesthesia, brain dysfunctions, genetic abnormalities, etc. The symptoms are dependent on the level of particle energy as listed below. WX Particle Amplifier Operation Manual. Instructions. The document is instruction manual for the WX Particle Amplifier. Due to the fact that there is great danger involved in its operation, please read the manual carefully before you proceed. Furthermore, the properties of LPX particles have extremely harmful effects to the body. This included simple sort of end of the part. What? Without AD. No effects. Anesthesia, nausea, headaches, genetic abnormalities, brain dysfunction, faint consciousness, unconsciousness. Intensity and probability of displaying the aforementioned symptoms vary depending upon the energy levels. With AD. You can last a bit more. AD adds up to 4,000 milliscalar value of protection, hence the increased levels. My brain's been defaulted to saying the wrong thing for so long that I have to stop myself. Adjust. Using the amplifier normally, the particle energy levels should not exceed 2,000 millisieverts. Used for advanced experiments, the particle energy should not exceed 4,000 millisieverts. I did it again! Damn it!
WX 粒子が脳機能障害やがんを発生させるっていうのは本当か？
そう。放射線とは違うけど、すごく危険なものだってことは間違いないんだよ。巨大なエネルギーを持つ WX 粒子は人間の脳内に入ると作用を起こし、いろんな機能障害を起こすの。さらに遺伝子にも働きかけて遺伝子変異を起こしたり、人をがんにしたり。だからこの施設の正体を知っているはずの浮田さんも数値が上昇するにつれて怯えていたんじゃないかな。
That in itself wasn't strange. Truly was strange was.
でも僕は N エリアに何時間もいたのに大丈夫だったよ。 今も全然大丈夫だし、ユーリも平気そうに見える。遺伝子障害も脳機能障害も起きてない気がするけど、これはどうしてなんだろう。
Melancholy shrouded Yuri's face when she heard Natsuhiko's question.
私たちは大丈夫なんだよ、ヒコリン。
Just affects the normies.
閉じ込められた人たちの中で、私とヒコリンだけは WX 粒子の数値がどれだけ上がっても関係ないんだ。適正度が S だからね。
Oh, so even Mashiro's gotta be suffering then.
どうして適正度が S だ
If
と
that's the
平気なんだ。
case.
実は WX 粒子によって起こるいろいろな体調悪化は BC の適正度が低いほど起こりやすいの。
Ah,
WX 粒子への耐性と BC の適正度ってのは比例するんだよ。適正度 F の人は WX 粒子への耐性を全く持たないけど、適正度 S の私たちは完全な耐性を持っている。脳も遺伝子も WX 粒子による影響を受けないの。私もヒコリンも9年前にそういう体になっちゃったんだよ。
え？9年前って僕らの適正度が上がったことも WX 粒子に関係あるのか？
Yuri nodded.
WX 粒子は人体に触れた時、まず脳に強く働きかけていろんな機能異常を起こすんだ。頭痛や嘔吐感はその表れ、肌のしびれとかも全部そう。さらに遺伝子に触れた時はそれを損傷させちゃうの。
遺伝子を？
うん。これは WX 粒子以外にも放射線とか粒子線とか電磁波とか原因が他のものでも起きうる現象なんだけどね。とにかく遺伝子の損傷が起こると人体はすぐにそれを修復しようとするの。
And when it damages the BC gene, it has a chance of being repaired stronger.
WX 粒子を浴び続けると修復が追いつかずに致命的なダメージを負ってしまうんだけど、損傷と修復が永遠と繰り返されるとごく稀に人体は WX 粒子への耐性を得ることがあるの。脳もそれに応じて変容して機能異常も起きなくなる。そして耐性の上昇は適正度の上昇と比例する。
Watase, Natsuhiko has the biggest brain.
それが9年前、私とヒコリンの身に起きた適正度が S まで上昇したっていう現象のプロセスなんだよ。
Well, Yuri does too.
なるほど。長年の謎がようやく解けたよ。
That does make sense how it's described. I think I like my description better, but it's essentially the same. Only aptitude doesn't change throughout one's lifetime. Damage and repair. Yeah, essentially endless cycles of damage and repair. It's occasionally been repaired stronger. It's like how... like the concept of building muscle. Damage and repair. But when your muscles are torn, little micro tears doing exercise, when they're repaired, they're built up. Stronger, larger. Essentially something similar happens there, which might not always be the case, but that's the scenario in which you gain more WX resistance and increase your aptitude. Natsuhiko and Yuuri were an exception because their bodies were flooded with WX particles during the fire 9 years ago.
だからユーリは AD の投与を嫌がっていたのか。そもそも投与の必要はないし、むしろ BC が使えなくなるだけだもんな。
そう。
じゃあ僕らは N エリアに行こうとガンになったりはしないってことだな。
うん。ある意味ではこれ以上はひどい状態になりようがないってことだけど。
Eh? Natsuhiko had a terrifying feeling about what she was implying. We felt that Yuuri was trying to tell him about the real danger of WX particles.
これ以上はひどい状態になりようがないって。
さっきの話の意味を よく考えてみて。適正度が高いってことは、普通の人が耐えられない環境でも耐えられるように遺伝子が変異しているってことだよ。損傷と修復を繰り返して元の形からどんどん離れて。
I don't like what you're implying.
だから
I get what you're
つま
implying.
り落ち着いて聞いてね、ヒコリン。私もヒコリンもすでに著しい遺伝子異常を起こしているの。もっと言えば全てのコミュニケーターは遺伝子異常の産物なんだよ。コミュニケーターか否かを決めるのは IGF2R 遺伝子という遺伝子。これは脳の構造に関わる遺伝子なの。
That makes sense.
本来
We've heard that name before.
IGF2R 遺伝子はタイプ1から9の9種類が存在する。だけどその遺伝子が生まれつき変異を起こしている人が稀に現れる。
それがコミュニケーター。
そう。
Tone of Yuri's voice gradually grew dispirited.
そして IGF2R 遺伝子異常は6種類存在するの。変異の度合いの大きさに応じて IGF2R 遺伝子タイプ E から S までの番号が振られているんだよ。適正度の上昇が耐性の上昇と比例することはさっき説明した通りだけど、それはつまり IGF2R 遺伝子が変異したことを指しているの。それが適正度の正体。IGF2R 遺伝子タイプ E は適正度 E、タイプ D は D、そしてタイプ S は S。 そして適正度が高いほど、つまり遺伝子変異の割合が激しいほど、そのコミュニケーターの寿命は短くなっていくんだよ。
I once at the more severe one's mutation, the shorter that lifespan becomes. A chill ran down Natsuhiko's spine. Yet Yuri kept painfully speaking the harsh truth.
コミュニケーターはがんの発生率が極端に高いの。あらゆる脳疾患にもかかりやすくなる。
Well, that's damn.
若いうちはともかく年齢を重ねるにつれ加速度的に死の確率は上がっちゃう。分かったでしょ。これ以上は悪くなりようがないっていう意味。私たちは9年前からすでに早死にの宿命を背負ってたんだ。コミュニケーター大発生からまだ16年しか経っていない。だから世間のほとんどの人はまだ気づいてないけど、大発生前に生まれた数少ないコミュニケーターたちはもうほとんどが死んでしまっているの。
Damn.
博士から聞いたんだけど、ヒコリンのお父さんもコミュニケーターだったんでしょ。しかも当時としては珍しい適正度 B のコミュニケーターだった。だから32歳で亡くなってしまったって。
Damn.
そんな。ラボはそんな事実を知っていながらどうして公表しないんだ。
公表できる？まだ早死にする原因も完全には解明されていないのに。なのにもし公表したら死の運命を突きつけられたコミュニケーターたちはきっと絶望しちゃうよ。
Correct. Natsuko choked on his words. That means we're already... So if they escape from this facility, they still wouldn't have long lives ahead of them. Their remaining lives would be shorter than his father's 32 years on this earth. That's awful. 15 years? 10 years? Just how much longer do we have left to live? Natsuko was horribly agitated by the hopeless truth. Feelings of nothingness rendered his heart into pieces. He held his head with a trembling hand. At that moment, he saw a wristwatch in the corner of his eye. His father's watch. His mother gave this watch to Natsuhiko. She may have already known about his fate as a communicator. If Tenkawa cried back then, despite rarely ever crying, Natsuhiko felt like that was perhaps the most telling sign of her emotions. So, Dad told me to be strong. Told me to become a man that could protect and support others. Father's final message from that day rekindled in Natsuhiko's mind. Natsuhiko took his crushed spirit and forced it back on its feet. Then looked at Yuuri and spoke. It's time for the tips, Yuuri. We've got a lot to read. So, just go top down. IGF-2R gene mapped on chromosome 6 that mediates induction and inhibition of the proliferation of certain cells. It stands for insulin-like growth factor 2 receptor. Research team in London once published findings that the gene may affect IQ, but their research was later disproved. Ah yes, IQ. Genetics say that the research victim fell victim to a logical fallacy known as the chopsticks gene. The fallacy is named after the anecdote of a researcher who claims to have discovered a gene that allows for skillful usage of chopsticks. In reality, the researcher may have merely found a gene common in Asian people. In other words, the roles of genes are too complex and intertwined to easily determine which genes play which roles. Once IGF-2R gene mutations were identified and confirmed to cause increased BC receptor development in accordance with Antoine Courbet's ESP synchronization hypothesis, the IGF-2R gene gained even more prominence. There is still no method of directly measuring the extent of BC receptor development. The extent of IGF-2R gene mutation has been codified so that BC aptitude can be calculated on a 7-step Sabkdef scale. Furthermore, it has been established through animal experimentation that mutation of the IGF-2R gene causes an increase in cancer susceptibility, and thus research is currently being conducted to determine if it is a tumor suppressor gene. Oh. It's the gene circuit breaker that you flip off, and then you turn it off, then you start just spawning tumors everywhere. Maybe it's something that gives some kind of roadmap for what's a normal template for cells, because that's essentially my rudimentary knowledge of cancer. That's essentially abnormality developing in cells that get out of control, spread, develop, get worse. It's largely not recognized as a threat by the immune system, right? There's a high chance that I'm very far off base there, but I mean, we're thinking the more this gene develops abnormalities itself, the more the person is susceptible to cancer. Makes sense. I don't think it would be as simple as a tumor suppressant, but something along the lines of some controlled gene that the more abnormal it gets, the more likely abnormalities in your cells around your body could develop. Okay, moving on. BC insulator. Material developed and implemented by Miyoko Tenkawa. Contains W particles using artificial BC receptors in medium. The artificial receptors interact with atmospheric M particles, causing the M particles to decay into W particles, thereby preventing the transmission of BC. This mechanism is strictly different from thermal electrical insulators. for the sake of convenience, they are still called BC insulators due to similarity of function. A special classroom in Rokume Academy, called the BC room, uses these insulators, thus allowing for the free performance and practice of BC. The BC insulated walls are essentially like soundproof walls, but for mental voices. I'd like that comparison. Leibo's outer walls, inner walls, and security gates are also made with BC insulator inserts. This use case isn't for the specific simple practicing of BC, but for the isolation of communicators. Yeah. So when Leibo is operating in a fully functional manner, you wouldn't be able to send BC across the building. You'd be limited to the room you're in, pretty much. When Leibo is operating in a not ideal manner, aka the walls are foobar and there's tons of WX particles everywhere, you can send BC everywhere. Brokian? The true Brokian. BC energy measuring instrument developed by Leibo. Artificial BC receptors installed in this device measure the atmospheric W and M particle levels, allowing the device to display a quantified BC energy reading. Its value is measured in units of milliscalar values, and the maximum measurable value is 15,000 milliscalar values per hour. Since its appearance deliberately mimics a radiation measurement device, the members of Sirius accept it as such without such question. Milliscalar? Unit used by Leibo deliberately cause the uninformed to confuse it with the more known MSV, the millisievert. The MSV used by Leibo stands for milliscalar value, not a unit of measure for the effects of radiation on the human body, but rather one for the amount of BC particle energy. The name for the unit was made with the intention of abbreviating it as SV. The name itself appears to hold no particular meaning. An end disaster at a nuclear power plant contaminates the land and food, being little positive prospect for the future. Rokume City and Leibo were doing something so dark, they'd rather cover it up as an end disaster than let the truth be known. Which is why Q resorted to terrorism to expose the truth. What? Where did that come from? Someone mentioned in comments in previous videos that a lot of these tips are very pro-government. AKA slanting the research and development of BC as a means to protect communicators. Which, from the perspective of the government would be wanting to weaponize the third BC skill. And yeah, that's highly possible. We might still see evidence of that down the line. They are definitely... A lot of the tips mentioning the government and the laws that were passed in the safe haven cities very much slanted in favor of the government protecting communicators. While in reality, they have created essentially prison cities. They're difficult to get in and out of. Heavily surveilled prison cities. Don't discount that when you're thinking about the government wanting to protect communicators. They are very much... If they are truly benevolently protecting communicators, they are doing that with extreme isolation and over-surveillance. But this one is definitely not anti-government. I mean, this one is definitely not government-slanted. An end disaster at a nuclear power plant. But Rokume City and Leibo were doing something so dark that they would rather cover it up as an end disaster than let the truth be known, which is why Q resorted to terrorism to expose the truth. That's very pro-Q there. What? We haven't seen any evidence so far of Q being anything other than anti-communicator. Like, there hasn't been any evidence of... There's been hints of stuff going on deeper in Labo, but there hasn't been any evidence so far that he was after anything more than to terrorize everyday communicators. So that's remained to be seen what the fuck that's about. I'm just... What? I'm just... Wow. Alright then. Melt effect. I am curious about this, because I feel like we might have seen some of the effects of this already. Senses sympathy must be used at point-blank range in order to achieve sympathy between the espers and the target's senses. This is due to the high volumes of information that must be exchanged by loading them onto M particles which decay with distance. However, after a communicator's brain remembers using senses sympathy on someone once, adds them to their senses sympathy address book, so to speak, the communicator can subsequently use senses sympathy on that same target from longer distances. This is called the melt effect. The extended range is roughly equal to the communicator's effective range of empathy. Don't ask me why it's called melt. Meltdown. Proprietary Labo jargon referring to a state of extremely highly concentrated WX particle emissions within Labo. The term also covers up such an event as a nuclear event. WX particles themselves are capable of causing serious brain and genetic damage, but an even more dangerous situation arises if a meltdown occurs at the same time as a case N. The meltdown negates AD's protective effects against subject N's, NBC, and senses sympathy. Eh? The same way that the melt effect extends a communicator's senses sympathy range, the fall down of WX particles generated by the amplifier also extends the range of BC, hence the name meltdown. Okay, this is giving us more ominous implications that we haven't been hinted at in the story yet. We've heard the name Subject N. We've no clue what that means. But now this is giving us the implication that the purpose of AD inside the facility is to protect you against Subject N. What? What is going on down, deeper and down? I'm starting to really believe that there's some ominous shit that Labo was doing. Maybe that one comment was right, and the government and Labo are effectively trying to weaponize this, and that's Subject N. And they have the problem of keeping Subject N under control, I guess. Good question. Holy shit. One thing I want to see, 130. Unlocked all. I feel like we've acquired a tip of the Procyon already. Wow. I was gonna say, I know I've complained about, I know I've complained a lot about, repetition stuff that this game has thrown at us this route and in the past, but even though they have been kind of retreading some stuff this time, it wasn't that bad. I think I've finally come around to it, so to speak. We have 167 tips. We have an uncertain amount unlocked, probably over 50%. But man, I did not expect that tip reading to be so explosive. My god. Wow, that was unexpectedly spicy. I want to see playing log. Yeah, we're over 50% tips. We're 50% seen titles. Album completion. Music completion. So there's still more music to see. We haven't seen We haven't even gotten a choice yet on this route. So, yeah, that was an unexpectedly explosive tip reading, which the tips seated us with more ominous shit than I expected there. But that's definitely got me excited going forward. That definitely got me back in the right mindset. We should be doubtful of Labo and their intentions. They're scumbags. And as I bring it back to what I was trying to get off my chest at the beginning of this video, Miyoko was the reason why Yuuri's experience didn't seem that bad. Yuuri was still held against her will, but Miyoko was there to be a mother to her and make her stay as comfortable as possible. And Miyoko clearly wanted to get Yuuri out at some point. And if she couldn't do it legitimately through legitimate channels, it's clear that Miyoko was willing to attempt it by illegitimate means. And she deserves a bit of respect for that. Miyoko is the reason why Yuuri's stay was nowhere near on the level of, say, Tsugumi's from Never 17. Man, I had a lot more to say than I thought. We're getting back into it. Getting back into it. And even if I felt like that first flashback sequence dragged, it was necessary. And I think the longer it's gone on since I went through that scene, the more I've been able to process it, and the more I've been able to come to accept it. More it's grown on me, so to speak. Alright, enough of that. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you next time.